Conley to move the motion.
Mil Magat, and I formally move the motion. And Bawatlam of Weekus a Karanul the Mokolaki, Visasta on Ruin Shaw, Hinu, Shin and Chakta Thomas Pringle, John Collins, Michael McNamara, Marion Harkin, August Michael Fitzmaurice, August is Kush Brodum, is Shoha Cor Oscorna Dala, August Ará go solir go bhfuil gá pránach lenar go a úsáid. Go mar hir neamhsplach, mar hir Neodracht. Níos mó ná riamh tá gá leis an go sin a clistal. Tá muid frí scá an chuga I Gaza. Agus muidna I mun canse agus I mun díspóireachta an seo tá daoine gasúr, leanaí, áharú fráidin na Gaza. Agus muidna ag seasamh gan rud a dhéanamh. Agus sin an cóhéics inniu ach bín cóhéics I gcónaí. Bhí cóhéics nuair a rinne an na Stát Aontaithe agus Sasanna coga mídalahúil san Iraq 2023, 5 bliain ó shin, an rud ceann céine is féidir 1 bhliain a úsáid agus rud a chuirigh cóhéics. Ach an rud is tábhachtí dúine an seo, tá muid ag rá go bhfuil gá le Neodracht gníomhach. Ní ionan an dá rud Neodracht agus seasamh leithíomh. Ní hé sin atá I gceist aganne. An rud atá I gceist aganne ná ról gníomhach ag bunú an méid oibre agus obair na gapel a rinne fear de ina fáil Frank Aiken ag gol siar. Ag tógáil sin. Ag tógáil an obair atá I dhéanamh ag ar cuid saidirí fud an domhan. Tógáil sin agus a choranúil go rud dearfach policy Neodrachta, ní policy dúilteach ach policy agus dúilgeis gurl chur leis chun I choranúil don domhan de bhar our esperis hain sa tír seo de bhar na stair na tíre. Go bhfuil bailí eile an. Go bhfuil muid sásta ar gochanna agus ar túramí a choranúil nuair atá rud mícheart agus égóir a dhéanamh. Agus rinne égóir muintir Israel nuair a thuí Hamas trasna na teorann. Níl drogal bithar mé sin a rá. Ach ag an am céine tá dúilgus orm agus oranne sa dáil seo ag choranúil go bhfuil égóir olmhór a dhéanamh ag arm na Israele faoi láthair. So ní féidir seasamh a thabhairt agus cáinú a dhéanamh dram amháin gan cáinú a dhéanamh an dram eile. Thank you, Taoiseach. It's an extremely important topic, as you well know, and I know it's dear to your own heart. I mightn't agree with all of your views on it. And I have put this motion today with the help of my colleagues, Thomas Pringle, John Collins, Michael McNamara, Marion Harkin and Michael Fitzmaurice, and I look forward to the support of other small parties and bigger parties here today. And I do this not to embarrass the government, not to be contentious, not to be argumentative, because now more than ever, with the focus on what's happening in Gaza, it's bringing into acute focus how we should use our neutral role in a very, very active manner. So I have to say, when I see your counter motion or your amendment, I've often used the word despair, and I try not to use it because we need to give hope. But I despair of what the government has put back in response to my motion. I've set out the articles in the Constitution, the most recent one put in after the Nice Treaty. I've set it all out, and you've absolutely ignored it. You haven't even acknowledged it in your counter motion that there's a constitutional basis here obliging us to take a peaceful role in the world. And then following the various referendums, we put in declarations, guarantees, warranties that we would not abandon our neutral policy. So going back to the Single European Act's ratification in 1987, it was acknowledged that Ireland's long-established policy of military neutrality was lodged along with the Single European Act's ratification instrument. The Maastricht Treaty in 1992, the treaty shall not prejudice the specific character of the security and defence policy of certain member states, including Ireland. The Nice Treaty, when the people of Ireland voted against Nice, the Seville Declaration was put in to facilitate the holding of a second referendum. That took us up to 2001 and 2. And the insertion of Article 29.9, which I've laid out into Bunrock na HÉireann, that the state would not take part in any EU common defence arrangement. Then we move forward to 08 and 09, the Lisbon Treaty, and when the first Lisbon Treaty was rejected, we have a guarantee put in to facilitate the holding of a second referendum. We've had repeated polls confirming the support of the Irish people to Irish neutrality, and the most recent Irish Time poll in June 23 found that 61% of the people surveyed favoured the retention of the current model of neutrality. And even the Consultative Forum, which you published the report, and I thank you for that, and I have serious problems with the way that was initiated and the way it was conducted. But I quote even from that, the Consultative Forum on International Security Policy, and the title alone, I hope I have time to come back to it. The chairperson acknowledges it was frequently expressed and rarely contradicted that there is currently no popular mandate in Ireland to abandon the policy of neutrality. There was a palpable and widely held sense of pride in Ireland's value-based foreign policy and global reputation as honest brokers and so on. There was a particularly strong sense of pride in Ireland's history of peacekeeping since 1958, an unbroken record with 508 Irish soldiers deployed overseas as of the 1st of October this year. A considerable majority, and that's use of words that when we have the debate I'll come back to, a considerable majority of those who spoke on this topic expressed the view that there is presently no public appetite for a change to the current position on neutrality and so on. I know you have repeatedly confirmed, Taoiseach, that you have no intention of joining NATO, and I take that on board. However, I find your statements in relation to our neutrality extremely worrying. Agus gan doubt tá blas na breg crofachta I gceist, tá breg crofach go smir sna ráiteas a hagan ó the Rhine. So while you say that you are not going to change our neutrality, your reply or your motion today, or your amendment tells us you have no plan at the moment. Now, given the history that I've just outlined, no plan, that's exactly what it says, no plan at the moment to change neutrality. The government reaffirms its commitment to a policy of military neutrality and reiterates that it has no plans to join a military alliance. There's no plans. Okay, so let me just look at what we're doing here, Taoiseach. 20 years ago, there was an illegal war in Iraq. You remember that? Huge protests on the street. I was part of 100,000 people that were on the streets of Dublin. I think over 1 million people in London. An illegal war. Fabricated reasons and propaganda. 20 years later, Guantanamo Bay is still open, just to bring home the consequences of what happens when we let a consensus mentality and propaganda take over. 20 years later, the UN rapporteur, and her title is very interesting, the Special Rapporteur on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms while Countering Terrorism. Fionnuala ní HÉileán, an Talamh Fionnuala ní HÉileán. And 20 years later, when she visits Guantanamo Bay, and she praises the Biden regime for allowing her and for helping out in allowing her technical visit. And I'm just going to read out, because it's important really to say, the Special Rapporteur, 20 years later, reaffirms the UN Special Procedures finding of structured, discriminatory and systematic rendition, secret detention and torture and ill treatment at multiple, including black sites and at Guantanamo Bay. She acknowledges that the vast majority of the men rendered and detained there were brought without cause and had no relationship whatsoever with the events that took place on 9/11. Every one of the 780 Muslim men who was held at Guantanamo Bay, including the 30 that remain there 30 years later, live with their own distinct experiences of unrelenting psychological and physical trauma. Now, I have to say, Taoiseach, this report is a moderate report in context. She looks at the victims and the effect on victims as well. She follows up 3 different strands, one of which are the prisoners and what they suffered. And I use that to say that 20 years later, that is just one of the consequences of what we allowed happen, an illegal war in Iraq based on propaganda. And so today we look, and in the context of Gaza, and we have rightly condemned Hamas. There has been absolutely no condemnation of Israel for the breach of international law. Absolutely no condemnation. And if we look at Hamas, and we look at who were the greatest supporters of Hamas, let me quote from Netanyahu back in 2019. Benjamin Netanyahu's statement at a March 2019 meeting of his Likud party's Knesset members, reported in Haaretz, the paper. Hamas was treated as a partner to the detriment of the Palestinian Authority to prevent Abbas from moving towards creating a Palestinian state. Hamas was promoted from a terrorist group to an organisation with which Israel conducted negotiations through Egypt, and which was allowed to receive suitcases containing millions of dollars and so on. This is Benjamin Netanyahu back in 19. That has been repeatedly printed in various media to say that was the active policy of them in relation to Hamas. You might reflect on that, Taoiseach. In relation to our neutrality, I have seen repeated comments, actually just on that, I'm just going to finish on that one, and it's been reported Hamas as a partner. Anyone who wants to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state has to support bolstering Hamas and transferring money to Hamas. That's what Netanyahu told a meeting of his party members in March 19, reported in lots of papers. And we go back then to the neutrality motion that I have before us today. And I have no idea, if you're committed to neutrality, why you couldn't accept even the first part of the motion, which sets out our tradition, our constitutional provisions, the comments of the Supreme Court in the very case took by the very courageous Ed Horgan, who acknowledged that the traditional policy of neutrality was dearly held by the Irish people. I have no idea why you couldn't have acknowledged that and come back to us to give us reasons why it can't be enshrined in the Constitution. You are going against the wishes of the majority of the people in Ireland. My experience, my reading, my listening has told me that the vast majority of people in Ireland want neutrality as an active policy enshrined in our Constitution and allowing us to take a proud position in the world in relation to conflict resolution. Building on our own past, on our northern troubles, what we've done in Colombia, and we've been very proud of that, what we've done throughout the world, why we cannot enshrine that in a constitution, other than your argument yesterday at the forum and presumably today that we need flexibility. Now, neutrality, if anything, has been extremely flexible since its origins, back with Wolfe Tone. It has allowed great flexibility to each government. But the kernel is that we remain non-aligned. The kernel is that we're not afraid to speak truth to power, as in this case with Israel. While I have the utmost understanding from where the Israeli people have come from and the Jewish people, absolutely understand their fears and their dread. However, what they have done to Gaza is simply unacceptable. An open-air prison for almost 17 years. A refugee status in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank from 70 years. Constant humiliation and degradations. And we have the UN General Secretary begging for a humanitarian opening for trucks to go in. 1 or 2 trucks, 20 trucks, when on a daily basis up to now, somewhere I understand between 100 and 500 trucks were needed to keep the people alive, 80% of whom are absolutely dependent on outside help and humanitarian assistance. And now we're not even letting in 1 truck. And we have the humanitarian organisations and the UN organisations telling us that they're going to pull out tonight. Collective punishment of the Palestinian people is a war crime. It's against all international human rights provisions, laws, and so on. I have no idea why we cannot stand up and say that and use our voice to say, what you're doing is wrong, we will work with you for a peaceful solution. I have no idea why we can't do that, Taoiseach. I don't know why we have to play games or why there's hypocrisy. We'll say something but not say something else. If we go back to the An Talamh Fionnuala Ní Sheileán and her title, it's worth looking at that because there was absolutely no mention of human rights in your consultative forum. Look at your title, look at the framing of that. And I'm not going to use too much of my time on that, except to say I was horrified at the manner in which it was set up and the framing of the discussion, and no mention of human rights, no open discussion on neutrality, no open discussion on how neutrality could serve us, but a framing in terms of terror, fear, and the war industry. You can shake your head all you like, Taoiseach, but at the end of the day, you and I have to talk to each other as human beings, and we have to find a way to reflect what the people of Ireland want. And shaking our heads, I've resorted to shaking my head myself. It doesn't really help matters, does it? But what you need to do is tell us why you think that we need to be more flexible in our neutrality policy. Given the debacle that has ensued following Hamas's attack on Israel and Israel's war on the Palestinian people, the debacle in Europe, the comments by van der Leyen and other people, and we waiting for a common response. We're a sovereign nation, a sovereign independent country that we fought dearly for that status. Why aren't we using our voice loudly and clearly to Israel, equally to Hamas, and also to bring a perspective to the whole situation that's different from Europe? The veto has been put forward as one of the reasons, the misuse of the veto, as to why we should get rid of the triple lock. The triple lock was vital in getting the various treaties passed, that we would need a UN resolution, that we would need the government and the Dáil. And repeated statements from you are telling us that that needs to be changed with more flexibility, without any analysis of what has happened in relation to the veto in the UN. And I agree it has been misused on occasions by Russia, by America, almost equally, if you look at the whole history of the veto. And recently, I understand, when Brazil brought a motion in relation to stopping the war or having a humanitarian pause, it was America that objected to that. Now, I understand when you look at Biden's speeches, not his less nuanced speeches, but the more nuanced speeches, if I might put it like that, he's saying, don't do what we did. Don't do what we did in Iraq and have the consequences of that. And you know, when you talk about training, and it brings in really hypocrisy to the fore, and we will send troops and soldiers over to train Ukrainian people to defend themselves. It would never happen, or never even be conceived that we would send our soldiers or our army to help the people of Gaza. So I'm not saying one should or shouldn't do it. I'm asking you to reflect on our hypocrisy, how we'll take a certain stand and a certain narrative when it suits the powers, and when it doesn't, we'll do something else. That's not what neutrality means. I won't go over my time, Garamagat.